Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation tonight. If it's your first time with the Gotham Center, of course, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of podcasts and event recordings, dozens of book talks, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our online education program, Gotham Ed. You can find those mini courses for adults at gothamed.com. Tonight is part of our regular series featuring some of the most provocative and interesting new research on the history of New York City. We'll be discussing two new books recently published by the University of North Carolina Press. Shannon King's The Politics of Safety, the Black Struggle for Police Accountability in LaGuardia's New York, and Emily Brooks, Gotham's War Within a War, the Policing and the Birth of Law and Order Liberalism in World War II era New York City. I don't think I need to say much to introduce our subject, our larger subject. These are the topics of police brutality, mass incarceration, have obviously become dominant themes of public conversation now for a decade. But the historians we'll be speaking with tonight, locate the origins of the story in an unusual place, at least in its more modern format, in a period that few actually associate with the rise of law and order politics or practice, New York in the Great Depression and World War II. The main political actors in this narrative are not the conservatives who normally feature in historical accounts or in accounts of this history, but liberals, in particular, the famous New Deal mayor Fiorello La Guardia and his police commissioner, Louis Valentine. Both championed a vision of professionalism that would ostensibly free the city's police force of the corruption and violence brought to light in the Seabury investigations. Their approach, Brooks argues, became a template that is almost hegemonic by now. But it met with continual protest, especially from Black New Yorkers, whom King focuses especially on in his book. Excuse me. There is, of course, a lot more to say, but I will leave it to our guests to explain what they mean in conversation. Allow me briefly to introduce them before we start. Shannon King is Associate Professor of History and Black Studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut, where his research has focused on Black activism in New York City from the early 20th century to the mid-20th century. He's the author of Whose Harlem Is This Anyway? Community Politics and Grassroots Activism During the New Negro Era by New York University Press, which won the Anna Cooper and CLR James Award and was named by Choice in 2015 as an outstanding academic title. His work has appeared in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Urban History, and Reviews in American History, and he has contributed essays in Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, The Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North, and Escape from New York. Emily Brooks is a full-time curriculum writer at the New York Public Library Center for Educators and Schools, where she served previously as a long-term fellow on a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, completing her first book, the one under discussion this evening. She received her PhD from CUNY's Graduate School in 2009, where she held a Mellon ACLS Community College Faculty Fellowship. And she has written about policing, gender, race, and city politics in the Journal of Policy History, the Journal of Urban History, the Washington Post, and other places. I'm delighted to welcome them both back to the Gotham Center. Before we start, the usual bit of housekeeping. The chat, video, and hand-raising features in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our guests. So if you have a question, you'll have to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do so at any point in the next hour, and we'll begin answering those questions around 7:30 or so after conversation. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guests.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. First,
Thank you for having us.
It's wonderful to see you both again. First, let me say congratulations. It was a pleasure reading these books. They're deeply researched. I learned a lot. Looking forward to this conversation. Why don't we start off by we'll take turns and you tell me what brought you to this project? Why LaGuardia's New York and policing? And Shannon, you can go first, or Emily, I'm not gonna pick.
Okay. So after the my first book, Whose Harlem Is This Anyway, ended with a quote unquote neo riot in 1928. But in the dissertation, I ended it with the Harlem Uprising or the Harlem Riot of 1935. And so um, for the purposes of the first book story, it made sense for me to leave out that final chapter that was part of the dissertation, which dealt with LaGuardia. And I also wrote an essay on LaGuardia and police brutality. And so as I was beginning to sort of dig deeper into a second project, I revisited the dissertation as well as the essay, and I realized there was another story to be told. And so that's the origins of the politics of safety.
When I started working on this project, I was training as an urban historian and as someone who had lived and has lived in cities all my life. I was constantly confronted with the fact that police are a central fact of urban life today. You see them everywhere if you're walking around. And they're a central component of city politics. But at the time when I was starting the research for this project, I felt like there was not that much research and scholarship on policing from an urban history perspective, outside of kind of two main moments that scholars had explored. And one of which was the kind of creation of professional police departments in the mid 19th century. And the other was kind of the mid to late 20th century and the kind of rise of mass incarceration. But there's this big period in the middle that had less scholarship devoted to it. And a few books by scholars who I really learned a lot from and loved were looking at the kind of later 19th century into the progressive era. And then these books almost to a T ended in 1935. And so I remember I actually talked to one of the scholars about her book later, and she was telling me that the prison that she had used as a kind of main archive actually had, it was either a fire or a flood, but so all the records after 1935 were destroyed. But so I was really interested in kind of what was happening in these middle years, which are of course a massive period of state building in American politics. We know we have the New Deal and World War II, and what is happening in American governance, what people are expecting from the government, what it means to kind of be a citizen is changing during this period in time. And I was interested to see sort of what implications that had for policing. And when I first started this project, I was really surprised by what a large role discussions of crime and policing played during World War II in New York City. That was something I was not expecting. And so the early drafts of this project were actually explicitly focused on policing during World War II, just those war years in New York City. But what I found when I came to kind of the end of that iteration of the project was that even though there were really significant and interesting changes in the way that policing was functioning in the city during the war years, what I was really seeing was a kind of intensification or a more successful iteration of policies that LaGuardia and Valentine had tried to introduce or had introduced, but had met sort of with a fair amount of resistance throughout the 1930s. And so for me, the story then became about the entire period that LaGuardia and Valentine were in office. I kind of sweep Orion under the rug there a little bit because his period was so short. But the entire time that LaGuardia and Valentine were in office, and looking at this kind of dual process of which one of which was how did they change policing in the city, and then the second one is how did the war intervene in those efforts.
It's this is not my area, but it's a little strange, as you kind of say, that there's this sort of lacuna in the literature, because that middle period is also, especially at the sort of local and state level, when we're seeing sort of criminalization of narcotics, we're seeing professionalization, which is such a huge part of your story, Do you all have thoughts about why that has been sort of neglected? Is it just that the literature is sort of just getting going, or?
I mean, I think that, historians are always answering kind of different types of questions. And so I think for a while, this question of sort of how do we answer the question of mass incarceration was a really driving force for scholars of policing in the carceral state. And then I also think that it there has been kind of a relatively recent turn to look at the role that liberal politicians have played in building the carceral state. And once that turn has happened, then this becomes a really interesting moment to look at. But prior to that kind of new attention, which I wouldn't say started with us at all, but is relatively recent. I would say prior to that turn, I think there was a little bit less attention because this is seen as a kind of moment of liberal strength. What do you think, Shannon?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that maybe over the last 20 years, we've begun to see much of the research was on prisons,
Mm-hmm.
and in particular, prisons post 1960s, or the 60s to the present. And then a lot of that scholarship focused on the 80s. An earlier wave of scholarship, when it did focus on some of the earlier periods, it tended to center uprisings or riots, which is what I try to not do purposely, right? So really it's 35, 43, 43 in Detroit, 64, Watts, right? LA, 67, etc. So either riots or prisons. The older scholarship that focus on the Black Power movement would also engage riots, but a lot of this was the sort of Black responses to to policing and riot. So really, my scholarship comes out of that earlier wave, which is why in my first book, when I wrote about policing in that last chapter, I was writing it in some ways, in similar ways that folks who wrote about Black Power in the 60s were writing about it. Mm-hmm. So not until maybe the last, is it 10 years, maybe with Elizabeth Hinton's work and Naomi Murakawa's work, do we begin to get towards sort of the liberal law and order? But again, that's post that's post 45. Yeah. So really, Simon Balto's work, Emily and I, Carl Sudler, it's very recent that folks are beginning to go a bit further back in the 20th century. So yeah, so that's a long way of sort of thinking about some of the cycles within the scholarship.
I would also, just jumping off that quickly, I would also say that I think that earlier wave, like Hinton and Murakawa, were focused more at the federal level. And then it was only kind of after that that there was more of a looking at the municipal level as well. Anyway, go on, Peter.
Well, no, I was just going to say, let's get into it. Tell us some, big picture question. What is so important about this era? What is so significant about what LaGuardia and Valentine do to sort of pioneer this new approach? What does professionalization mean? And tell us a little bit about what you see as so important about what's going on in New York in this period.
So for me, the 30s and the 40s are significant in the case of New York because it precedes the Seabury Commission, as well as the Wickersham Commission. And so the Wickersham, of course, is federal, Seabury is state. And so in many ways, that sets up the possibility for LaGuardia to defeat.
And Shannon, can you just remind our audience, if they're not familiar, what were these, what was Seabury
Sure.
about?
So the Wickersham Commission, late 1930s, late 1920s, was basically a report to evaluate unlawful policing. And essentially, the outcome was that there was lots of unlawful policing, in particular, the third degree. The third degree was a method that was used in police stations where the police would force sometimes answers or beat convictions out of people under custody. And so this was widespread from the late 19th century, even after the Wickersham Commission. But essentially at the federal level, it sort of set up what would begin to challenge police discretion in important ways, because the question was, is it necessary to use this aggressive force in order to find truth, right? And so then, of course, you have the Seabury Commission, which is more about New York City, the state of New York, in particular, corruption in New York City courts, and really Tammany Hall, to put it more directly. And so that also sort of set up the possibility for LaGuardia to use widespread corruption as a sort of entry point to offer a clean government. And so that became the pretext for professionalization. Now, although I write a little bit of it, it's really more so context for me to really talk about LaGuardia. And so, I'm really sort of summarizing some of that scholarship to do that. But what it does do for the book is it helps to set up LaGuardia as a reformer, someone who's committed to clean government, someone who is committed to cleaning up the police department in particular, and especially someone who comes from a background where he was really supportive of the House of Labor, right? And so what becomes important in the beginning of the book is how I write about the sort of this tension between LaGuardia's support for workers writ large, but less support for Black folks, right? So the way I write about it and frame it is that much of the professionalization was really directed at controlling police discretion in cases of labor strikes and the like, and less so as it related to engaging with African Americans or Black people or women on the streets. So that's sort of the entry point. But the larger story is really looking at how sort of this police state is constructed in this particular moment. Really using Black and brown, although I mainly focus on Black folks, but using Black and brown folks as the pretext to expand policing, similar to how we might talk about, not to force contemporary conversations, but similar to how the governor is using crime as a pretext to send the military to the subways, right? So similar, but we could sort of see this in the 30s and 40s. So that's part of the book. The other part of the book is trying to lay out how Black folks are responding to both police brutality and crime and the various ways they articulate and organize around these different forms of resistance. And of course, I can say more later. But.
Yeah, so just building off of that, for me, this period is hugely significant for a number of reasons. So one, as Shannon said, we have a massive crisis of police legitimacy at the federal and state level. that completely implicates the dominant political system in the city. And so it is only through the Seabury investigations that Shannon just described that LaGuardia is even able to win office in 1933. And we know this because he ran in 1929 and lost very badly. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle called him the worst beaten Republican candidate in the history of the city. And so, you know, these Seabury investigations in New York City were a huge deal. They were a front page of the city's biggest newspapers for weeks and weeks, and revealed all kinds of widespread corruption, particularly in the NYPD. And so when LaGuardia comes into office, he also has his kind of own personal history with kind of oppositional city politics and this idea of government corruption and favoritism. And so he comes in, when he comes into office, he is very committed to this reform mandate. And the kind of showpiece, I argue in my book, like the central showpiece for him of that new mandate is reforming the police department. And his time in office becomes really important because he's in office for so long. And he's in office during a time when we have massive government expansion. And so his policies become really significant. And in the form of policing, what his kind of vision for professionalism is a vision that I think we now would recognize as kind of what we expect policing to be today, which is that he argues that the police department has to now be nonpartisan, meaning that he's going to punish partisan favoritism or party favoritism. So when police officers are giving favors to people because of their political party or getting promotions because of their political party, which was how the police department functioned entirely prior to this. It was entirely an adjunct of the city's political machine. So he says that police are now going to be nonpartisan. They're going to be professional. He raises the requirements for the civil service exams. He gets rid of some kind of loopholes where people could get jobs without taking the civil service exams. He makes limited room, and maybe we can talk more about this after this kind of opening part, but he makes limited room, and Valentine does as well, in the department for women and Black men, mainly white women and Black men. There's like very, very few Black women in the NYPD during these years. Now, those positions are very circumscribed. They're very racialized. They're not proportionate to the population. They're very gendered, and there's massive discrimination within the department. But they do recognize the utility of incorporating groups that are heavily policed into the police department in very limited ways. And then there is the idea that they are going to aggressively police the city for low-level crimes of vice, which LaGuardia and Valentine both see as directly connected to police corruption. So their argument is kind of in the corrupt old times under Tammany, crimes of vice like sex work, which they called prostitution, or juvenile delinquency or gambling, these crimes, the police were not arresting people for these crimes because they were just taking payoffs and allowing these crimes to flourish. And so now, no longer. Now we're going to have an aggressive anti-vice campaign throughout the city. And the NYPD is going to crack down on these crimes of vice. And so that was their kind of framework and argument. And they're also at the same time creating this kind of larger, especially LaGuardia, this sort of like larger vision of urban citizenship, with the idea that your relationship to the government shouldn't be contingent on your political affiliation or your party relationship. You shouldn't have to necessarily be a supporter of the party that's in office for you to have kind of the rights of citizenship. However, when they are directing officers to police for these types of crimes, and then they're sending the NYPD out to look for them throughout the city, they're directing officers to do that entirely using social identities of race, of class, of gender, and sometimes of age and geography. And so this kind of language of equity goes along with this incredibly unequal and targeted and aggressive form of policing that is very intense on Black New Yorkers, as Shannon writes about, that is intense upon women, working class women, poor women, and young women. And that increases the police presence in Black communities under the justification of preventing vice. And all of the kind of hallmarks of those eras of policing, I would argue, are still with us today.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, and both your books go into just like just such big detail on all the different sort of sectors in which the police are going into, but it is sort of, there are these moments where we're hearing about this reform vision that LaGuardia has, and it's jarring to see the disjuncture between this language of sort of inclusion and having a more sort of professional and ostensibly like non-discriminatory police force, and then this language that comes out, especially from Valentine, but not exclusively, about stamping out vice or stamping out crime in these targeted communities with utter ruthlessness, as somehow a break from the past. Is there, Shannon, I mean, your book is, you describe your book in the introduction as the birth of the first protest movement, a Black protest movement in New York City against police violence. And there's so much conversation in the book about obviously the Amsterdam News and other newspapers and Black leaders are constantly sort of protesting this heavy police presence in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant and other neighborhoods. What is the sense among the community outside of it? Is there no sense of the weird thing is, reading your books, is there's this constant reference of all this protest, and yet it seems like this doesn't sort of leave these communities. There is no sense of disquiet among the sort of wider community about what this means in practice.
Right. So part of what I write about has sort of two parts. So the first part is really how you can see these two key moments, right? One is what we would identify as the traditional Great Migration, and then of course there's a second Great Migration, and both have to do with Black folks moving from the South, Caribbean, and elsewhere to New York. And so what you begin to see in the case of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Brooklyn is that that's that second wave. So you see folks moving from Harlem, but also different places of New York and outside, from the South and Caribbean to Bedford-Stuyvesant. But that first wave in New York catches hell from policing, right? This is during the 20s. And I sort of write about some of this in the first book. And so the issue of police brutality is already always there, and people are responding to it, but it's not necessarily what we would identify as a movement in terms of a series of campaigns, et cetera. So I wanted to sort of frame it in a way to say that even late 19th century, early 20th century, folks were responding to police brutality. But part of what those larger waves do is that they are clashing against white communities who are trying to contain Black movement. And one of the ways that you contain Black movement is first through using real estate as a weapon to contain them. When that doesn't work, you start using policing. And so what you find in Harlem in the early 20th century, you find that they use real estate, what I call real estate wars, policing, and even white gangs to slow down the expansion. It's unsuccessful. By the late 20s, early 30s, African or Black folks are the majority. That creates the context for 1935 Harlem uprising in the midst of the Great Depression. And so as a liberal, LaGuardia is like, we need a commission. We need to address this. And in our history, as in our U.S. history, we've seen this, whether it's LaGuardia or Lyndon Baines Johnson and others. Watts, we always have a report, but that's one of the earlier moments besides the Chicago report in 1919. And so with the report basically says, the police are the cause of the uprising, and your New Deal administration isn't doing what it ought to do. LaGuardia.
This is the commission about this
exactly.
This huge civil unrest, or whatever term.
1935 riot.
1935. There's it's
Yes.
a big event, and the commission is chaired by E. Franklin Frazier, very prominent Black sociologist, and a host of other sort of
exactly.
names. Yeah.
Right. So it's hosted
already there. It's a little sort of unusual. I mean, vis-a-vis like the Tenderloin riot or these events in the past, right? And yet, go on.
Well, remember, LaGuardia is a liberal, right? He's a fusion. Starts as a Republican, segues, becomes fusionist. He's trying to bring all these groups of people together, right? Trying to create a sort of liberal racial democracy, or at least rhetorically. Yeah. And so the commission is comprised of multiple, both conservatives, liberals, blacks, whites, and all, right? But the report never becomes public. At the same time, Harlem is occupied by the police.
And because LaGuardia suppresses it.
Well, well, that's part of the story, but no, they're responding to the riot in March 19. So Valentine has the police there for a year. LaGuardia is also supposed to be pushing for the research. So you have people who are part of the committee saying, hey, we need to publish this. We need to publish this. This happens over a year. Within that year, there's still police brutality going on. Sure. And so, but in order to do the research, they have public hearings. So everyone in the community knows already because they were part of the public hearings. So this builds the community's consciousness, because not only are they pissed that the report hasn't come out, but they've also participated in these public meetings, and they're experiencing police brutality. Yep. And that violence begins to impact this next community, which is the Bedford-Stuyvesant in the 1930s. So in both places, but it's a younger community. So in both places, you have police brutality. So in Harlem and Brooklyn, simultaneously, you have all these, sometimes they're going to court, sometimes they're going to the mayor, sometimes they're going to the police precinct. So for a whole year, and this is what I mean by this movement, folks are bringing police brutality at the citywide level as opposed to the neighborhood level for the first time in significant ways. So that's what happens in a nutshell. But in the case of Bedford-Stuyvesant, it's a new community, so it doesn't have the sort of political and organizational structures that you find in Harlem. And so that's what you begin to get in the 40s, which is later on in the book. But I'll stop there.
I also think another part of the story is that post Seabury, under LaGuardia, part of these reforms and under Valentine is that police violence and harassment becomes more racialized and more targeted. And so before, in the 1920s, of course, police violence was, I would say still, and Shannon would know more about this than I would, but definitely disproportionately targeted at Black New Yorkers. But there were also cases of just sort of police brutality against white New Yorkers. It was not that unusual. And in the Seabury investigations, one of the stories that got a lot of front page headline attention was the story, hi Zell, can you go with Papa, please? Sorry, was the story that women, including women with a lot of social capital, so white married women who were employed, were being framed for sex work to be extorted. Okay, yeah, come give me a hug and kiss really quick. Okay, hi. Thank you. Okay, okay, good. So
We made
white,
it a half hour. That was pretty good.
including white married women, Bizel, thanks, with who had jobs were being extorted by this network of police officers, magistrates, and bail bondsmen and shaken down for cash. And that was really got a lot of press attention. People were horrified by this. There were undercover police informants who testified in great detail about their role in that ring. And in the wake of those revelations, the numbers of arrests of white women for sex work dropped really significantly, but the numbers of arrests of Black women increased, both as a proportion of the whole and just in the raw numbers themselves. And so you see Valentine is regularly telling members of the NYPD this kind of two-pronged message. Like, to the public, he'll say, our message to the public is, we are at your service, we're selling service. And then at the same time, he's saying also publicly to the press, muss them up when you have an arrestee, get blood on their collar, beat the crooks and the criminals. Part of this story is that white New Yorkers are, I think, during this period, become less targets of this kind of violent and unpredictable and corrupt modes of policing, but they continue and become even more intense for Black New Yorkers. And you can also see this through like the Juvenile Aid Bureau and the Police Athletic League. If you read the NYPD's internal magazine, Spring 3100, during this period, it includes short stories written by police officers who they would send them in, and they could be selected as the short story of the month. And in some of these short stories, the police officers would write about, they're fiction, but you can see the kind of ways that they are conceiving of their own role in their job. And they would write about building relationships with working class white boys and sort of joining together with them to stop the Black criminals. And so I think that's also kind of a part of the story. And then throughout this period, throughout the 1930s and 1940s, people who studied the Women's Court, which was the court that arrests for sex work was prosecuted through, wrote big reports with a number of data in 1935 and 1941, two different authors. And both authors of both reports commented on the dramatic disparity that Black women experienced in arrests for sex work, and commented that they were struck by that disparity, and that they believed that it suggested that the police were targeting Black women rather than that it suggested a difference in behavior. And there are a number of episodes that I write about in my book where Black women also led organizing campaigns to protest the ways that the police were depicting them as sex workers or carriers of venereal disease or sexually transmitted infections, as we would call them today, which was another kind of anxiety of the time that was used to justify really intense policing of Black women during the war years.
Could you talk, just as from your book, could you talk a little bit about Ann Petrie? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so she was one of my favorite characters in who I got to write about in my book. She was, during the time that I write about, she was a journalist, but she was also a novelist. And shortly after, at the kind of end of the time that I write about, so around 1945, around the end of the war, she would publish The Street and become the first Black woman to sell over 1 million copies of a novel. But before that, she was a journalist at the progressive Black newspaper, The People's Voice. And she was a part of an organization called Negro Women's Inc. that organized around issues that were of concern to Black women in Harlem. And she was a part of a number of organizing campaigns during the war years. So there are two episodes that I write about in my book. One was what began as kind of a rumor that was published in one of the big white newspapers in the city, that white servicemen were going to be barred from Harlem, that Harlem was going to be labeled out of bounds for white servicemen. And the sort of implicit justification there was because the military wanted to prevent them from meeting and interacting with Black women who, again, were criminalized as sex workers and carriers of venereal disease during this period. And I'll just add that there was a really big kind of the perception of how venereal diseases or sexually transmitted infections worked during this period was that they essentially went from women to men. And there were a lot of, as people may know, very racist ideas about how these diseases kind of progressed in people's bodies. And so this rumor came out. Valentine was quickly kind of interrogated about it. He said, "Oh, that's absolutely not true." The writers for the newspaper that published it wrote a second article like the next day saying, basically saying we were wrong, but we talked to unidentified members of the NYPD who actually thought that that was the policy, which is interesting because it implies that basically that's what the military police and the NYPD were sort of doing unofficially. But so Ann Petrie and other women who were involved with the People's Voice picketed the newspaper that ran the story and said that it was slander against Harlem and against Black women. And then another episode was around the campaign to close the Savoy Ballroom, which was one of Harlem's biggest nightclubs. It was also a big kind of social institution in the neighborhood where fundraising events or society events would be held. And it was one of the only interracial nightclubs in the city at a time when leisure was still extremely segregated. And it had been under surveillance throughout the 1930s. The managers and owners regularly said the NYPD was always trying to close us down. They hated that there was interracial dancing. But it's only during the war years when there's this kind of new attention and focus and anxiety about protecting white enlisted men from sexually transmitted infections, from kind of threats to their health and morality that are posed by women, particularly in this case, supposedly by Black women, that the NYPD is able to actually successfully close down the Savoy Ballroom, and it provokes this huge outcry from Black newspapers and from organizations. And Ann Petrie writes a great public letter to LaGuardia, just slamming him for this and saying, "You do things for every other sector of New York society. Are you saying you can't?" Because LaGuardia had said, "I can't intervene. There's nothing I can do." And he was, sort of famously interventionist in every element of city government. And so she's saying, "You're saying you can't do anything about this closure. But is that because Black people go to the Savoy?" And then she interviewed a bunch of Black women about their thoughts on the Savoy. And had they been there, what do they think about the closure? And they all were pissed, and they all had these kind of wonderful takes saying, "Are we as diseased as they would have everyone believe? Like 1,000 times no to your pens to write letters to LaGuardia criticizing this closing." And so she was a really kind of amazing journalist and writer and early activist during this period. And I'll just add that I used, in addition to her articles and her published work. I used her archive that's at the New York Public Library at the Schomburg Center as well. And she has all these kind of amazing letters where she wrote about her own experiences going to the Savoy and like how everyone was like seen and be seen and who would be there. And then just sort of these stories about her day-to-day life going around and reporting. That was really this really rich and kind of fantastic source.
We're about 15 minutes in, and we have some folks clamoring to hear more about Valentine. How important is Valentine? Maybe we can sort of just briefly say who he is and how important is he to this story?
I think he's hugely important. I was sort of couldn't believe that more people hadn't written about him, and I will never get over the fact that his autobiography was titled Nightstick. He
I mean, some of the quotes from him in the book are in both your books, but
Yeah, I mean, he was a co-builder with LaGuardia of this new policing regime, and he was incredibly savvy for his time. You know, as Shannon writes in great detail about how kind of successful the NYPD's treatment post of the Harlem uprising was, and how much kind of credit he and LaGuardia got. And he was kind of regularly publicly meeting with the New York Urban League and other groups and saying things like, well, I just wish that more qualified Black men would apply to work at the NYPD, you know, at the same time as he is pushing these incredibly racist policies, which he also talks about pretty explicitly. But he was very savvy on all of that. You know, he'd been in the NYPD since 1903. He had a long career, and he himself had seen the way that that your political allegiances were kind of the only way to build your career. And so he had served in an internal anti-corruption unit, and then later been demoted because he wasn't aligned with Tammany. So he was kind of an internal advocate for for anti-corrupt policing. And so LaGuardia saw him as an ally on that front. And he, I think, was very, very successfully built a national profile at the same time that he was building this new policing regime in New York. And at the end of the war, he has a brief period where he's a commentator on Gangbusters, which is sort of the early Law and Order kind of pro-cop pop culture that glamorized policing and focused on very sensationalized, high-profile crimes. And then he was tapped to oversee the U.S. War Department's supervision of the reorganization of civilian policing in U.S.-occupied Japan, because he was seen as the kind of foremost proponent of municipal policing from a U.S. perspective. So I think he's hugely influential, and he's still, you know, in 2009, the now publisher of the New York Times wrote a very glowing blog post about him as a kind of tough and incorruptible police officer, police leader. So he still kind of has this reputation as somebody who was both not corrupt and really tough, and being tough is kind of framed as a positive thing by a lot of people. So I think he's hugely important. I'll stop. Shannon, go ahead.
No, I'll just add one thing. I agree with you completely. But the one thing I'll add, and I think you said a bit of it, but he was so savvy, and he was really good at using the press to articulate his views. And so in that way, you could, across the Black and white newspapers, you had some of the same rhetoric, right? And so that was important for my book, because part of what you begin to see is how some members of the Black community begin to internalize, well, not internalize, a strong word, but begin to use the same rhetoric to demand more policing within the Black community. And so the whole question of politics of safety has a lot to do with these tensions within the Black community about how one defines safety. Is safety simply safety from crime? Is it safety from policing? And when you have both of those issues at hand, which do you prioritize? And so one of the key tensions is the ways in which Valentine was able to use a lot of that rhetoric, whether it was Urban League, NAACP, talking to the leader of the NAACP, Walter White, having conflicts with Adam Clayton Powell, like there's this incredible dynamic that played out in the press, but also Valentine speaking directly to the New York Times. And so one of the key points of two of the key chapters in the book deals with how the press is sort of in many ways spreading the rhetoric of Valentine as if it is accurate, while Valentine is saying different things to the Black community. And so you sort of see these internal conversations between Walter White and Valentine and others, and then you also see how Valentine is talking directly to the press about muscle up policing, etc. So he was quite adept at using the media in ways to push forth his agenda.
We have about 10 minutes before we're going to start taking Q&A questions from the audience, but I want to ask a question to context. Maybe we can sort of wrap both in here. How important is the Depression context? How important is the war context to your stories, Steve?
Well, I can start. I mean, for me, the war context is a kind of big part of my story. It's hugely important, I think. So the sort of trajectory that I see throughout the time period that I cover in my book is that, LaGuardia and Valentine come into office 1934. And they have, as we've been discussing, this kind of vision of reform that they're starting to implement. And it is, from the start, extremely aggressive, extremely unequal, and is met with a significant amount of resistance. And throughout the 1930s, they're sort of trying to implement this new vision of policing. And I focus a lot in my book on the kind of new aggressive enforcement of vice, or morals laws, which is kind of what they were called at the time. But these were very low level violations where the only complainant is the police officer. And so these are sex work, juvenile delinquency, gambling, and the kind of regulation of disorderly spaces. And with the mobilization for World War II, what I found is that these violations, which throughout the 1930s had been very important to LaGuardia and Valentine to police for them, and they had framed them as sort of essential issues of urban order, and sort of with the idea that if you have these sort of disruptions in your city, it will injure the reputation of the city, and it's a violation of the kind of rights of law-abiding residents, as they framed it. But with the mobilization for World War II, these violations, these low-level crimes, are no longer just questions of urban order. They become issues of national security. And so there's this kind of massive new political impetus behind these modes of policing. And there's a new military and federal infrastructure around supporting policing for them. And so particularly for policing for sex work, there is a massive new attention and concern around protecting the health and morality of white service members. And so there are new federal agencies created, the Social Protection Division, the city's health department works very closely with the NYPD, and there are military installations around the city that also work very closely with the police department to surveil sexually profiled women throughout the city. And at the federal level, there is actually new legislation passed in the form of the May Act that makes sex work near a military installation a federal crime, and allows for the FBI to be called in to surveil if local law enforcement isn't being aggressive enough. Now, that was never necessary in New York because LaGuardia and Valentine were already deeply committed to that project. And LaGuardia actually testified in favor of the May Act and argued that it should have been stricter. But there is this kind of new federal infrastructure there as well. And so what this means throughout the city is that there is this kind of new, it's not a new, completely new, but it's much more robust than previously network where if an enlisted man goes to a venereal disease control center to seek treatment for a sexually transmitted infection, he's interrogated about the source of his infection. And then that whatever information he shares is shared with the NYPD, who then follows up on those reports. And that actually intensifies this kind of targeted policing because there are other policies in the city that the NYPD uses, like what was called the raided premise policy, where if there had been an arrest at a nightclub or a bar or a restaurant for a vice or morals laws offense, then the NYPD could label that establishment a raided premise and station a uniformed officer on the premise to surveil the patrons. And that's actually why Patrolman Collins, who was surveilling the Braddock Hotel on the night that he had an altercation with Marjorie Polite, which then he then shot Robert Bandy and arrested him and his mother and Marjorie Polite, and that is the incident that precipitated the uprising of 1943. The reason that he was there was because there had been reports that enlisted men had contracted sexually transmitted infections there, and so it had been labeled a raided premise, and there was an officer stationed there. This was also true for juvenile delinquency, because there was this idea that dads are going off to war, mothers are going to work, who's watching the kids? And so there is kind of new attention paid to surveilling youth, particularly young women, but not exclusively. And then it also kind of plays out in interesting ways for things like gambling, where you can see there's a very racially bifurcated mode of policing, where LaGuardia tells Valentine to basically tell NYPD officers, if you see a white serviceman gambling or violating curfew once the curfew had been imposed, just send them home. And he tells soldiers coming through the city and sailors, if a military police officer or shore patrol is bothering you, just call a city cop and he'll help you. So essentially, white servicemen are kind of exempt from a lot of policing during the war years because their labor is already mobilized for the war effort and they're framed as an essential component of fighting the war. But this is not the case for Black soldiers, and we can see this because there's an episode that I write about in my book about Black soldiers who are stationed on Staten Island in a majority white community, and the white residents around the Fox Hills Army encampment where they're stationed precipitate an entire sort of crime wave hysteria. It's really mobilized by some very local politicians who are trying to advance their own careers, but there is a significant support from white residents and business owners in the area. And it becomes another kind of flashpoint of organizing for Black newspapers, in particular, even ones who are based in Harlem. They write about it on Staten Island. And ultimately, the NAACP, the Mayor's Committee on Unity, which is one of these committees that LaGuardia creates to try to suppress racial conflict. So the target is the kind of the unrest or the conflict rather than the like civil rights violations that lead to the unrest. But anyway, so he creates this committee. So the committee, the NAACP and the Army all send undercover investigators to this one small neighborhood in Staten Island, and they're all kind of interrogating people that they can find on the street, and the soldiers to try to find out what's really happening. And the soldiers tell the NAACP investigators that they feel like they're being treated like prisoners of war. And ultimately, all three investigators come to the conclusion that this was basically made up to serve the needs of the white community members. But so the war plays a huge role in how these kind of narratives of crime and policing are operating and functioning. But it's very different depending on the different kind of segments of society.
Shannon, same question to you.
Um,
I do think I'm not going to preempt your question, but I do think it needs to sort of be said here too. Is this is in the context of the Depression, which for neighborhoods like Harlem is worse than possibly any other in the city, right? So,
sure.
um,
Yeah. So a quick one way of thinking about it is raising the question: how well did LaGuardia liberalism respond to the damage of the Depression in Harlem? So, Cheryl Greenberg has an excellent book that addresses some of this. What she does not censor, though, is policing.
Yeah.
And so part of what I lay out, part of the reason why the Great Depression and World War II are important is in response to the Harlem Uprising of 1935, you get the report, which LaGuardia never makes public, but it is leaked to the New York Amsterdam News. So we do learn about a draft of the contents in July 1936, right? Which
This
is
is
why
Harlem's newspaper, the Amsterdam News. Yeah.
exactly, Harlem's Black newspaper. So this is why we all know, because the official, and you can actually find the official report at Columbia University. But anyway, so what we find out are the limits of New Deal liberalism in New York City. So there are not only criticisms of the NYPD, but there are criticisms of various departments of the LaGuardia administration. So that becomes important because here we begin to see partly why it was important for LaGuardia not to publish it. But what we also see is how that also becomes the context for mobilization by Black folks in Harlem, but also Black folks are reading about it in other parts of the country, and especially folks who have just moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant. So that's one thing. The second part, and the key part, is some of what I was referencing earlier, is that white New Yorkers, both in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is this newer community for Black folks, right, and in Harlem, are all responding to Black protests because Black folks are not only demanding better resources, relief, etc., but they're also trying to reform the police department. And that also elicits sort of a, if we can use a 1960 language, a backlash, right? You get a backlash among white Harlemites and whites in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so that also creates the pretext for an expansion of policing, because part of what the book lays out, all of this, so really, Great Depression, you see this more so in Harlem. World War II, you see this more in Bedford-Stuyvesant, right? And so you see some of the similar patterns, except that, of course, you have more Black folks in Harlem, and in many ways, the white folks in Bedford-Stuyvesant are saying, we don't want that to happen. In Harlem, we don't want the Black people to take over. So that's why you see this incredible mobilization, very racist, but sometimes dog whistle politics in Bedford-Stuyvesant, because they can see that there's the potential for Little Harlem, which is what Bedford-Stuyvesant was called in the 30s and early 40s, to become big Harlem, and of course it did. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why those two moments are important for my study.
Okay, so we're at 7:35. Technically, I'm supposed to turn things over, but I'm gonna piss off the audience a little bit. And that's one more question before we do. Lessons. We have to have the lessons question. What's the big lesson from this period? 5 seconds or less.
Well, I think for me, a couple lessons are one, that there is no moment in policing history that we can look to as a moment when policing wasn't kind of grossly discriminatory and wasn't being deeply criticized by heavily policed communities. One of the reasons why I think this is such an interesting period to look at is because this is a period when, in many ways, the US government and city government was providing more social services. Public life was becoming more equitable and more robust. And of course, policing isn't the only sort of exception from that. Many scholars have written about the exclusions that Black Americans experienced during the New Deal. But still, if we were to kind of look at a moment where we might think, oh, maybe this is a moment when policing was less problematic, or where we might see some more equitable treatment, this might be a moment that we might think that would be true. And that's absolutely not the story that we find here. We find that this kind of vision of the most expansive, or one of the most expansive visions of urban citizenship, emerges with this deeply racist, discriminatory, and incredibly aggressive model of policing that I would argue we have continued to live with through today.
So a quick lesson that I would say is be aware of the various discourses public officials use as the pretext to expand policing. So whether it's in our subway, well, I live in Connecticut, but in your subway station, the present, whether it's the 30s and 40s where the language was crime wave, and we still use that language, by the way, or in the 60s, it was law and order. And so you see all of that language in the 30s and 40s, but a lot of that language was used as the pretext or context to sell the idea for the need for more police. So as soon as you hear some of that rhetoric, it's usually following demands to increase the policing in some state, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the lesson.
Well, on that note, I'm going to take the first question from someone I assume you both know, Alex Vitale. Hi, Alex, who asks, did either of you find examples of heavily policed communities articulating community-based safety demands as an explicit alternative to intensive policing?
Yes. So part of what you get in the commission, the LaGuardia commission, which was a response to the uprising in March 1935, and then it's leaked in July 1936 in the New York Amsterdam News, is the demand for more civilian involvement in policing. It wasn't the same as what we might call the Civilian Review Board later on in the 40s and 50s, but the way I think of it is it's sort of that initial discussion about the demand to have some kind of relationship with civilians who are not in the police departments, so they could potentially inform, in this case, Commissioner Valentine. But it wasn't quite what we would call the Civilian Review Board, because they were not asking for complete independent civilian oversight of the police, but they did want some kind of involvement. That's one case. And so there are other cases that speak to more approaches that pertain to what might happen in the Black household, what might happen in Black churches, those kinds of things, which is sort of part of what we might call respectability politics. So there were both what one might call liberal and conservative responses about alternative approaches to policing that had to do with quote unquote law and order.
One sort of interesting small example that I found was related to the forced incarceration and treatment that many women experienced for treatment for sexually transmitted infections, which was, I'll just briefly say, extremely prolonged. It took sometimes over a month and was not effective necessarily, had horrible side effects, and many of the women who were incarcerated and forced to undergo this treatment were forced to do so after a negative lab result because of their social history, which basically meant they had been arrested and perhaps not even convicted for prostitution. But there was a huge that was one big component of the kind of carceral network for policing women during this period. And there was this very interesting, small study where some doctors and social workers proposed treating women, not forcibly incarcerating them. Basically, if you couldn't pay for your own treatment, you were sent to the city's hospital for communicable diseases, and you're forced to stay there until you were labeled non-infectious. And this group of doctors and social workers proposed an alternative program where women wouldn't be forcibly incarcerated, but would instead have free treatment and work with doctors on a voluntary basis. And they found that women were more likely to complete treatment, perhaps unsurprisingly, in that situation. And so that was an example of, taking a health treatment out of the carceral space. And it was very successful, but it was a very small experiment. And the vast majority of women who underwent that treatment were forced to do so in this mode of imprisonment.
Shannon, we've got a question to you from someone by the last name of Chapman, who asks how your work distinguishes from Clarence Taylor's book, Fight the Power. Fight the Power, African Americans and Long History of Police Brutality in New York City.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Taylor's work, who I think it's somewhere behind me. So he mainly writes about post 45. I think he really starts in the 30s and the 40s, but the majority of the book is really post 45. And he mainly writes about police. So if we were to look at the period of my book, which is the 30s and the 40s, the way he covers that period, he mainly writes about responses to police brutality.
Yeah.
And he centers, and Emily is going to have to remind me the name of Adam Clayton Powell's newspaper.
People's Voice.
People's Voice. So he centers the People's Voice as a response to police brutality. And I think he has another chapter that focuses on the Communist Party, I think, maybe that's the 50s. So what I do is a bit more grassroots. So my book tries to get at police brutality, not only writing about the experience of police brutality, which you don't necessarily find a lot of in his book, but I also talk about how various groups at the grassroots level who may not have belonged to the Communist Party, the NAACP, et cetera, may have responded to. So sometimes it's just litigants. And then oftentimes it's sort of various responses of police brutality that carry over the course of time. So I try to actually follow particular stories. He does some of this in his later chapters, but less so in the 30s and 40s. So really his book is about post 45. The other huge difference is I also write about how the Black community responds to crime. So really the book is about the notion of the politics of safety is that policing and I could have said this about the lessons learned. I think that was the language we used. But one of the issues with the politics of safety is very much about the idea that Black communities didn't even receive the services of protection. So in that way, they were both victims of police brutality, but also victims of crime, partly because the police chose not to protect them. And so the question of safety should be understood in a more robust way. And because of that, a lot of what I write about in the book is Black folks demanding protection, right? So they're both demanding police accountability in cases of police brutality, but they're also demanding protection from crime, right? So that's really the huge difference.
As in the Fortner and Foreman books. Owen Gutfreud, hi Owen, has a question for Emily, and I'm going to piggyback on it. Is there evidence of dissent within the fusion movement because of this topic, where there are city council members or board of estimate members or any other white poles calling out LaGuardia or Valentine on these racist practices? And I'm just going to just throw on top there. I mean, one of the things that's so bothersome about the story you're telling is this is also, the context is also that New York City is really sort of the epicenter for what we could sort of just simplistically kind of describe as like the revolt against scientific racism, right? It's like this headquarters for all of this within the sort of academic intellectual world. You know, it's the context of fascism in Europe, and there's this sort of revolt against a lot of these notions that are sort of going on, and yet as your stories sort of show, like that doesn't mean much in terms of policing. In fact, it's going the other direction. So I don't want to confuse Owen's question, but again, is there dissent? Is there politically or intellectually or?
Honestly, the only dissent, the only kind of political dissent that I saw was from the white Communist Party city council members. So like Peter Caccione was kind of regularly at these protests saying, you know, the Midtown Civic League, the, you know, racist white homeowners group in Bedford-Stuyvesant, calling them homegrown fascists, and, you know, was regularly at those protests criticizing Valentine and LaGuardia for these policies. And then the other kind of mode of white dissent that I did see was from people who were policed as part of these crackdowns. So white parents whose mostly daughters, but also some sons sometimes, were picked up by the police during the war. There was one episode that I wrote about where some girls were arrested at a roller skating rink, and their parents, and they were, you know, held for a long period of time. And when their parents picked them up, they wrote letters to LaGuardia saying, "Is this the freedom we're all working so hard for?" And then, you know, like white women who were also heavily policed and surveilled during this time for who were kind of sexually profiled, were also quite critical of these policies. And some reformers, some white reformers involved with the women's court raised questions, as I mentioned before, when they wrote reports about the policing for sex work, and questioned the gross disparity in arrests between Black women and white women. But what I saw was that it was really mostly from people who had some kind of direct connection or experience with this form of policing themselves, or from, you know, oppositional city politicians who already had a kind of different political framework, like the Communist Party members. I did not see a significant amount of criticism, or hardly any at all, from members of LaGuardia's own party. I will say that when you look at the papers of these groups, like the Mayor's Committee on Unity, their internal papers, they are concerned about these policies, particularly at the way that they might precipitate more moments of mass unrest. So
Mhm.
like in the case, in the episode in Staten Island, they were having meetings and they were saying there were a couple of soldiers who were arrested for allegedly participating in a fight, and they were being held without counsel. And the members of the Committee on Unity were really worried that they were going to have a kind of sham trial, and that Black organizations in the city were going to be outraged, and it was kind of going to be another explosive incident. And so they actually hired lawyers for them and followed the case quite closely. But that was kind of in an effort to preempt a larger conflict, I would say, not a kind of political criticism of these policies.
Quick comment. I mean, I feel like LaGuardia was really good at promoting, Peter, and I think you used this language in one of the emails, cultural pluralism. So it was difficult to identify any obvious, especially at least rhetorical act which represented some kind of racism. So really the only thing you could do is address actions. And so exactly as Emily laid out, usually those who, if there was dissent, it was usually victims or organizations associated with those victims. But there was dissent from whites who believed that LaGuardia was protecting Blacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a big part of the book is also about how they felt that, to use sort of the language that folks used in the 1980s and 90s, they felt that LaGuardia was soft on crime.
Right.
So there was all kinds of criticisms directed from whites and public officials and judges and the newspapers directed at LaGuardia. And so that was a different kind of dissent, because they believed his cultural pluralism was in fact protecting these Black criminals.
Yeah. Linda Gustafson asks, why didn't LaGuardia have the police act more forcefully during the vis-a-vis the fascist party in New York, especially the big rally at Madison Square Garden? I mean, the other thing is, New York City is like the epicenter for fascism, both in terms of the Christian Front, which is very heavily sort of like Tammany affiliated and has deep roots in the police department. There's the German Bund in Yorkville, which is sort of the headquarters for the American fascist, the Nazi movement. There's the sort of Mussolini support within sectors of the Italian community. There's incredible panic in the city in this time about this, and that's part of the call for, at the federal level, things like House Committee on American Activities, creating an independent FBI, and all these other sorts of things. So it's part of a sort of larger, I think, sort of state building, police state building sort of moment. But do you all have comments on that?
Well, I mean, one thing I will say is that there was a sort of mini scandal where there was a small sect of the Christian Front in the NYPD in 1940 or 1941. And as a result of that, LaGuardia instituted a policy where members of the police department had to sign a statement saying they were not, forget the exact language, but like a member of any affiliated group or something like that. And they were sort of strictly told that any kind of affiliation of that sort being made public was kind of unacceptable. But that sort of overlap between far right and fascist groups and the police department is present even in this early moment.
Yeah, I don't write about that, but in terms of the secondary scholarship, there's a lot of discussion around the distinction between how he used the newspapers as a form of critique, but he was very careful about how he used the police. And so you see that all throughout, especially in 1934 with the labor movement. So I feel like LaGuardia was really careful with trying to appear that he was not intervening, though, as Emily mentioned earlier on, he constantly intervened in different issues. And so he was just very sophisticated about protecting, the idea that the government was clean. And so I think a lot of what the secondary literature really talks about is sort of these rhetorical criticisms of fascism, as opposed to using the city government itself as a means to repress it.
I also think he made this kind of clear distinction around policing and politics, and like policing for what he categorized as crime. And so like, Shannon writes about um the taxi workers strike, and like that they were told to protect the rights of workers to protest. And he was very committed to not being seen in as a kind of partisan politician. So I think also he, to some extent, was invested in making this, respecting and making this division between like politics and crime.
Um, we got a few more minutes here and a few more questions. So Joanna Klemenko asks, how does this story relate to attempts by LaGuardia to clean up Times Square, banning burlesque, performing sweeps of undesirables, etc.?
So in my case, it relates directly. I mean, the campaigns like to close down burlesque shows throughout the city, LaGuardia had tried, and his commissioner of licenses, Paul Moss, had been trying to do that throughout the 1930s with mixed success. But during the war, a case had gone to the state Supreme Court sometime in the 1930s, but was shot down on a kind of civil liberties defense. And then during the war, this another similar case is upheld to shut down burlesque venues in the city to protect the morality of enlisted men. And I think the Brooklyn Daily Eagle called it like another effort to attack burlesque in the name of protecting soldiers. And during the war, Valentine actually created a new police squad called the Division of National Defense that was mostly charged with patrolling Times Square and looking for sexually profiled women and soldiers and sailors with women to try to break them up, usually arrest the woman involved. So Times Square was because one of the kind of areas of concern for LaGuardia and Valentine was that enlisted men were going to come into New York. They're coming for a good time. And they're going to spend a few days there on leave, and they're going to contract a sexually transmitted infection, and then they're not going to be able to fight in the war effort. That was like one of their concerns during this period. And so, Times Square as a,
I mean, it's a huge entrepot, right? Millions of soldiers passing through it.
Exactly. And Times Square is like a nightclub hub in the city, and, a spot to go out. Another newspaper in the city described it as a gauntlet of GIs that women would walk by passing down the street. So it was one of the a key spot for policing and a place that Valentine and LaGuardia were very concerned about.
So I've saved the last two questions, and I'm going to wrap them into one from Coleman, Brustus and Savannah. Both are really sort of iterating again on the question we left off with at the end of the conversation. What did you take away from in your research on this subject as the then and now comparison? What are I don't want to say lessons again, but both are asking how did your perspective change on today, writing about yesterday, and or what should we know?
That's a great question. I guess a lot of what my book deals with is discourse. So a lot of what I learned was how to understand the relationship between multiple institutions. In the case of the book would be the police, the courts, and the press, and how they were shaped by what was happening in the case of New York, Harlem, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. The white community were able to use those institutions for their own political goals. So for me, one of the lessons is that even though you might read something in the newspapers, or even when you hear about new policies, the question becomes what's happening on the ground that resulted in public officials or the press responding to what was happening on the ground, which later resulted in some kind of practices and policies. And so that's the only reason why you get, in the case in the book that I'm writing, that I wrote, and again, as I said, when we think about what's happening in New York now, that's the only reason why you get police to show up, because they're choosing to prioritize particular communities over others. There's always something happening in the back behind what the police do, what public officials do. And so that's why it was important for me to ground these questions within the communities first, and how these issues eventually went up to LaGuardia or Valentine, who eventually sent particular contingents of police to particular places in Harlem, not all of Harlem, right? And so the last thing I'll say is a lot of what you read about in Harlem and a lot of what we hear now is that despite the presence of the police, people still feel unsafe because police don't stop crime. And I'll end there.
I'll be there in 1 second. Zach, can you get her? I'll be there in 1 second, okay?
We almost made it another hour.
Okay. Sorry, just 1
No,
second. Sorry.
you're fine. Well, I want to.
So, I'm sorry. I'll just say a couple of things that occurred to me, or that I feel like I learned from writing this is like one thing I was just thinking about a lot was and is today, like, why is it so hard to bring any meaningful change out of municipal police departments in this country? And it just seems like over the past few years, there have been so many really like powerful, sustained movements to make change and very little concrete results. And to me, like writing this book sort of answers that question, because I just sort of felt like we've never had any other model. Since we've had the model that we've had today, we have had these same problems, and the model that existed prior to the 1930s is also not one that we would really want to go back to. And so this is the kind of only way that a lot of Democratic politicians are willing to think about safety. And it's deeply unequal and damaging and problematic. And then the other thing that really stuck with me in writing this book is when I started writing my book, I thought that I was writing a social history of policing. And what it ended up being, in my opinion, is a social and political history of policing. And I just felt like I was hit over the head again and again with how inextricably connected municipal politics and the police department and the power of the police department is in American politics. And that is true in the period that we write about. It's true in the earlier period. And I would argue it becomes even more true in the later years of the 20th century when police unions and agencies kind of consolidate their power even more and become just play a huge role. And I think that that's really true today as well. And so those are kind of two things that stuck with me that are not super uplifting, but I think are useful.
Well, it's a solemn note to end on, but a proper one. I want to thank you both for joining tonight. I want to thank everyone for watching. I want to congratulate you both on fine works of scholarship. And I hope that I run into the two of you again sometime soon. Yeah, thank you for writing the books, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you, Shannon. It was so fun to get to talk about your book.
Yes, it was wonderful, wonderful, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.